This podcast is part of the Shareable Podcast Network. Learn more at shareable.fm. This podcast is Shareable. I'm your host, Jeff Gibbard, commonly known as the world's most handsome strategist and professional speaker. I'm also a superhero. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single Shareable episode. And that's it. That's the intro. Short and sweet. Let's get to the show. So, today on Shareable, I have David Fortino, Chief Strategy Officer, that is, of Netline Corporation. And he specifically asked that he be introduced with this song by Tool. And I am a very accommodating host here at Shareable. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You didn't think I was going to do it.
Super happy to be here. It was a bit of a test, actually. So filling out the little form in prep for the podcast. Yeah, it was something.
No one's ever
any special requests or something like that on there?
Well, it was like, how would you like to be introduced? Because some people like a formal introduction. Some people just want me to kind of wing it. Right. And you're the first person that has ever requested a song. I felt like it was,
I love it. So thank you, first of all, for honoring the request. Yeah, I often think of the situation where, like, preferably, especially pre-COVID, when we entered the office, I always had hoped that, someday everybody would walk in each morning to their own preferred theme song, kind of like you're coming up to bat as a batter. That should be a thing.
I think it is a thing. So I was on a kickball team, and our team name was Kick in a Box, and everybody had a walkout song. So anytime you went up to kick, you had a song.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really, really cool. And it's funny because I actually was doing a podcast recently, and I was asked, what my theme song would be. And the first song that came to mind for me was All I Do Is Win by DJ Khaled, because it's just a little bit ridiculous.
Sure.
It's just a little over the top, just a skosh.
I like it.
So I kind of went with that. Yeah. So what's up, man? It's good to have you on the show. I'm really glad that we're gonna geek out a little bit. So listeners, today is a geek out kind of episode.
Love it. Yeah, it's content about content, right? So
yeah, man.
Super excited to be here.
Cool. Thanks. I don't often get the opportunity to talk to someone in your stature of overseeing of things and insight into things. So I really am excited to really pick into your brain about this content report. So for those that don't know who Netline is and have never heard you on another podcast or seen any of your things, why don't you just give a quick introduction of who you are, what Netline's about, and then I got a whole bunch of stuff I want to dig into.
Sure. Yeah, let's do it. So Dave Fortino, Chief Strategy Officer here over at Netline. Netline is the owner and operator of the largest content-centric B2B lead gen platform on the web. Remove all the buzzwords and jargon I just said, and quite simply, we help B2B marketers translate their content into engagement with their preferred prospects that develop in the pipeline. And so if you've got webinars, case studies, white papers, podcasts, you name it, if your goal is to create that content as a way to foster dialogue with your ideal customer profiles and or target personas, our platform allows you to do that, but the byproduct is not traffic, right? Which is typically what you would see for much of the industry. It's to take that idea of targeting a persona and distill that down to actually a person, meaning an actual user gave you their voluntary information that you can then cultivate and translate into dialogue, whether that's nurture on a marketing side or escalation over to sales and so on. The key byproduct is always first-party, fully permissioned data that our clients can then leverage and ultimately drive that into booked business, right? That's the goal of all of this. So from a technology perspective, we are powering the lead gen stack for over, close to now 14,000 pieces of content across the platform, covering about 8,000 marketers, specifically leveraging the technology to accomplish those goals that I was mentioning earlier.
Rockin'. Well, I came by Netline by way of John Steyert, one of my favorite human beings, and he introduced us. And it's funny because when he first came to Netline, I looked at the site and I was like, okay, and 6 months might have gone by, and then I was like, John, what is it that you guys do? And so we had a conversation. He told me a little bit about it, and then you and I had met, and I wound up running a couple tests on Netline with a couple clients of ours, and we had put a couple pieces of content out there to try and generate some leads. And it was like 48 hours later, we had like 25 leads for this client. We had spent like a stupid little amount of budget relative to, like, I have a very deep background in running Facebook ad campaigns and LinkedIn ad campaigns. I've done like all of these different things. We have these complex funnels and all of this stuff that we do. And we like literally were just like, oh, let's try out this Netline thing. And we threw like $500 at it. And like all of a sudden we had a stack of leads that were like, we had like the lead data we even got, like versus like your Facebook lead data where somebody has like their Yahoo address tied to it. And you don't even know if it's, the email that they use, and you have nothing else. And then we get this list from Netline. I was like, okay, we have like their company name, we have their first name, last name, we have their phone, like we have all of this stuff. It was like remarkable to me. So
yeah, that was
my intro.
No, and that's awesome to hear, because that's really the core value prop, right? Which is, the deliverable leads that people or users are providing their data by consuming content that you've pushed out across our platform. But what you really spoke to were really two elements. One was the performance-based pricing model, which I didn't mention. So unlike most B2B SaaS software, you're paying on an annualized license or a cost per month per seat basis. This is completely performance-based, but it's on a CPL or a cost per lead basis. So unlike running, and you had said you'd mentioned your experience with social, unlike running paid search and or amplified campaigns with social, or even maybe an Outbrain or a Taboola, those are all CPC generally. You can use CPM as well. But both of those models, although good at creating exposure, and that could be a goal of yours, it's just not a goal of ours from a company perspective. Our goal is to deliver first-party data that users have provided. And this gets to your second point, which is you put your content out there. Our system has an algorithm called Audience Target. Distilling this into a really simple perspective, it's nothing more than a one-to-one matchmaker. It's taking first-party data that users have already provided to us, so where they work, their company name, their company industry, sub-industry, job level, job function, job area, matches that to their content consumption behavior, and tries to bubble up content that we feel not only is relevant to who they are as a professional, but most importantly, gets to your filter requirements as a client. And so when you're talking about getting leads that like match the criteria that you desired and also having rich data sets, it's because of that matchmaking process that we're able to say, okay, out of all of these audiences, it's not about targeting a group of people who we think are, I don't know, IT decision makers. It's definitively targeting IT decision makers in specific size companies, in certain industries, and so on. As a customer experience that you experienced, those are the only leads that you receive. So unlike a traditional, I don't know, if we're going back to your search example, you're paying for traffic and hoping that those users net out into a lead. In this case, it's the opposite. You don't pay for traffic. You're paying for leads that definitively match your criteria. You decide what that criteria is in the interface, and that's it. So it's it's a bit upside down model for people who come from paid social and or paid search, where the onus is really on you to drive that final element of the pipeline, where it's or the funnel, whereby you're buying traffic, you've modeled everything out, and you're trying to get to a lead. Ours is kind of saying, well, your starting point with Netline is getting a lead, a user who's definitively engaged with your content, provided data, which is fully permissioned for you to then take forward. So glad you had that experience.
When I first heard about it, before we had run a test or whatever, I very much was like, okay, what's the catch? Because it definitely sounds a little nutty. So just for the B2B marketers listening right now, I would strongly suggest checking out Netline. This is not in any way a commercial for Netline. Like, I didn't bring David on, said I could like pitch Netline or said he could. Like, I've just legitimately had a good experience about it. And we're going to talk about the 2021 State of B2B Content Consumption and Demand report that just came out. They do this annual report, and what you guys put into it is like absolutely like mind boggling. Was it like 40 petabytes of data was analyzed to like come up with all of these insights? So that's what we're going to talk about today. But I didn't want to neglect to kind of give people the context of like what this platform is, what it does, and why it's credible to listen to what the heck you guys have to actually say about it, because it legitimately works. And I've kind of taken to the posture of, if I have a B2B client, instead of kind of what my original recommendations would often be, paid search, email marketing, lead funnels, things like that, and social marketing. I've now started to go towards like, let's just come up with a really good lead magnet. Let's get it on Netline as your starting point. Let's generate some leads to start with, and then let's integrate that in with a more holistic, large scale campaign that includes awareness, consideration part of the funnel, et cetera. But like, if like the goal is like, we need to get leads now, like it's just such a great platform that you guys have. So just wanted to give you that shout out and those kudos. But
Yeah, thank you.
I want to pivot to talking about a number of different things here. So the content consumption demand report is definitely one part of it. But before we do that, I want to start out on this thing that you've mentioned kind of in talking, you've mentioned first party data and third party. I want to talk about the first party data, third party data thing for just a few minutes if we could.
Yeah.
Because I think it's the sort of thing I've seen it in a lot of your marketing out there. Like I follow your content out there. I mean, I follow John, so I see a lot of your stuff come out. And I see this term first party data thrown out there a lot. And I think if you're in the inside of the industry, you're like, oh, well, that makes sense. I know what that means.
Sure.
But for those who are maybe, not necessarily like hardcore B2B marketers that are like learning every trick of the trade and, in it daily, but they are in a B2B company and they're in the marketing function, and it's not quite clear to them why the heck it matters first party data versus third party data. What's the difference between the two? Why do I care as kind of the underlying thing? Let's start with, for the company itself, the marketer who's going to be doing marketing, why should they care about first party data versus third party data, specifically related to what it means for them as a company? Leave the customer aside for the time being. We'll get to that. But just for the company, why should I care as a marketer?
Yeah, I mean, this is all about, and I even add the component here that you don't have to be a B2B marketer to care about this. B2C is appropriate as well. First party data is about having a direct relationship with a user that has voluntarily provided their information. And so if you've been paying attention to a couple of different things, right? There's been a ton of governmental pushback across the entire globe at this point around giving users their rights back, around data ownership, around targeting of data. Largely that's because of the misuse of ad tech, whether you're talking about Google and or a global conglomerate and a mud of an ad tech ecosystem. Everyone's really and unfortunately abused a lot of free tools that are out there. Giving users the ability to engage with content didn't ever mean to an end user that their data was being sold 75 times when they visited a web page, right? The average user, to your point, has no idea that stuff even takes place. Short of them maybe situationally reading something or seeing like a 60 minutes briefing or something like that on TV, they don't really know what's happening when they're visiting a web page. And so part of this movement towards the importance of first party data really and unfortunately is driven by the abuse of user rights over the past decade, if not more, by advertisers and or ad tech companies. When it comes to first party data and what that means for you as a company, it means that because they voluntarily gave you that data, you're already at a point well beyond this notion, and you've probably caught me mentioning this a few times about person versus persona. You're not guessing who this user is. You know it's Jeff or it's Dave because of the fact that they told you that. And by default, if the goal of all marketing is to try to drive dialogue through trust and build credibility so that they purchase, whether it's a B2B software solution or simply purchase, I don't know, I'm a cyclist, so like a new bike frame, let's say something like that. A lot of that is built upon that level of trust of the brand, right? What do they stand for? What do their products stand for? Are they quality or not? By you providing that information, you're opening the door to have a two-way dialogue versus historically, and still happening until 2022, targeting anonymous cookies and really extracting as much data as possible on the user without the user ever knowing that that's occurring. And so, you're seeing a movement afoot, both from the ad tech industry being forced to get away from third-party data use from a government perspective. You're also seeing Apple lead the charge from a device perspective of saying, we're going to put privacy rights first. We don't care, Facebook, that I believe I saw like 13% of users who are now seeing the opt-in consent message within the Facebook app are actually consenting to share data with Facebook. As you can imagine, that has massive
I heard it was
implications.
much lower than that. I heard it was like 6% or 4%
Well,
are
let's
saying, yeah,
hope
you can
so.
try. Yeah, I'm down with it. I've been ripping on Facebook for like a
Yeah.
decade at this point. So
Yeah. And so, like, I think, Facebook, because of their size and their ability to sell that data, that's one issue. I think from my perspective, though, it's less about one single entity monetizing you, and it's deeply concerning that when you visit any major media property, there's 30 to 75 cookies immediately dropping on you. That means your data was just sold. And what also means is that your data was sold, but also continuously sold without you knowing and or being privy to it moving forward.
or benefiting from it.
Yeah, you're not getting financial benefit nor any other user experience benefit. That's it. And so first party data is about really users taking their rights back and saying that I'm deciding who gets to engage with me as a brand, and I'm deciding what I'm willing to tell them and or give them so that they can learn more about me. Uh, I think lastly, because of the deprecation, and Google amazingly has been leading the charge here, of cookies and cross-site domain usage of cookies, that's going to have massive impact on a lot of the other historical awareness type initiatives, because of the fact that you're not going to have as great of a level of targeting moving forward as you do today. Starting 2020, you'll be dealing more with cohorts and or groups of populations that are like-minded. But definitively, if you're relying on display-oriented targeting initiatives, you're going to be really dealing with groups of people who you believe have a propensity to convert into whatever you're looking to accomplish. So the sooner you're leaning towards first-party data, the more likely that you'll be operating not only from a form of consent, which is hugely important, but also a form of and a position of knowledge, right? You actually do know definitively who this person is, and you've gotten past this idea of just targeting personas and hoping that a person nets out at some point and raises their hand. You see constantly across the industry, it's like give people an experience or give people content or offer a product that people actually want. It's true, it's common sense. But if you do that, and to your point, I believe you mentioned like let's create a great lead magnet. Yeah, create some content that's truly valuable to the person, whether consumer oriented or B2B, that helps them do whatever their interest might be better than what they would have been doing perhaps the day before. By doing that, they're going to give you some data to access that, whether it's an email address or more. Great. Beyond that, though, if your content truly stands for what you said it would be, now you've developed a relationship that you can reference and say, hey, we've just offered you this foundational element of knowledge or tips or whatever it might be to make you more productive. And there's a subliminal context that's created there between that user and the brand that distills into loyalty and trust. From there, that's how you build lasting relationships and ultimately customer relationships as well.
Got it. So there's an immense number of benefits. I mean, some of the big ones I heard there is just, the targeting is like a really big one, that you're able to actually kind of one-to-one, because people have volunteered their information rather than sort of the gleaned profiles that all these other networks are offering to you. And then you have the kind of the trusted relationship that's starting out with, because you're building it on permission in the beginning. And I'd imagine there's a lot of marketers who might think, okay, great, well, I'll add that to my mix, but I'll still use all of this other sketchy third-party data while it's still available and get what I can. And obviously that is kind of what it is. The benefits to the consumer, I'd imagine, are very much around starting to claw back some of their rights around their data. And just kind of in brief, I'll ask you, how far do you see this going in the future with this move from third party to first party? Do you see that we're actually going to get to a point where consumers actually have full rights over their data, and that the relationship between people and brands is going to be fundamentally changed and it's going to start to be on a more level playing field? Or do you see this as sort of like, you guys have found a unique diamond in the rough kind of niche, got ahead of the curve, we're doing this longer than others, and saw this as a really great opportunity, but that the powers that are trying to sell people's data right now are just going to find sneakier ways of capturing it? Like, do you see that it's going to shift back, or do you think that it's going to move into this space where we have this sort of data autonomy utopia?
Yeah. So as much as I'd love to be the optimist here and say that users control their rights moving forward, whether that's 10 years from now or 5, it's hard to believe, simply due to the fact that there's billions of dollars being spent around retargeting on the display side of the industry, and third-party data. I mean, there's public companies that solely sell data that's been scraped across the web. That's crazy to me.
Yeah, that's crazy.
That your product as a company really isn't anything more than data that you perhaps you modeled, I would say, stole from users, which is, it's mind-boggling in a way. So as much as, I'd love to believe that users get to a position where they're the gatekeepers truly of their data, I don't know if that's realistic. That said, I do foresee this continuing for some time forward, where we get to a point where it becomes extremely uncomfortable for ad tech, to the point where there will be consolidation, where some companies are just going to be compromised. They don't have alternative paths of either data capture and or direct relationships with users. If you're not a media company and you have nothing to give a user in order for them to voluntarily share their data or even consent to a cookie disclosure, then what is your existence, right? What is the data that you have? Because if theoretically you have no direct relationship with the user through editorial or anything other, the question remains, is like, where is your fit in the overall ecosystem 5 years from now? Because right now, I mean, you saw last year, right? And the year before, a ton of companies have actually left the EU and closed their third-party data marketplaces in the EU. And these are big companies, like Oracle probably is the largest, and said, we're out of third-party data sales in the EU because of GDPR. If same, we're seeing this with CCPA in California, and the US is trying to consolidate and kind of normalize one's national standard for data rights and protection. If that happens in the US, those companies will be forced to do the same exact thing. That if it becomes no longer feasible to sell third-party data at the scale where they're making hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars, then that then drives fundamental change. So perhaps the shortest answer here is that, users are still going to keep pushing. And I think smart politicians will continue to rally around this and saying users deserve the rights behind their data. But companies will be innovative. You're already seeing some folks try to create a cookie alternative, kind of based in fingerprinting, which is probably a whole other chat someday. But that I don't think is viable either. It's kind of like, not that I have one of these, but it makes me think of like radar detectors. And they used to be big, I guess, 20 years ago. But the joke about radar detectors was that every generation of a radar detector you bought and put in your car, the police would then just innovate their own radar technologies so that they'd have better ways of you not detecting them. Then the radar detector would come out with a better version to detect that new radar standard. And it would continue on and on and on, to the point where now I don't know if people buy radar detectors anymore. So, so I guess that point was maybe users started to give up, right? Where they felt they've made enough impact here and there's not much more to be gained.
Got it. All right. Well, let's talk about this content consumption and demand report. So you guys put out an annual report every year, and just the long and short of why you do that. What are you hoping to accomplish by putting that annual report out? Like, what sort of value are you trying to deliver to people by putting this out? And kind of what's the kind of high level quick overview of like, what is the report about?
Yeah. So the report's completely about content consumption behavior that's occurred across the B2B web over the past year. It takes a look at all that first-party data that we capture, removes all the personally identifiable elements that people have shared, and we try to distill that into observations and learnings that B2B marketers can take away and apply to their own day-to-day tasks and strategies, really, from a marketing execution perspective. Our goal for the report was nothing more than to give back to the industry. And it kind of gets back to, you had mentioned a lead magnet, right? And I was saying, task yourself with creating content that really helps someone do what they do. So if it's a consumer oriented piece, and I don't know, you're a running brand, like how can you make a runner better at what they do, regardless of whether they buy your product? If you can, and I don't know what the answer would be to that question, but if you could come up with some piece of content around training or something like that, then that's going to be your piece and your foundation to build from. Ours was this, in that it's one thing to talk about, processing a ton of first party data and delivering customer experiences like the one you had referenced earlier. It's another thing to let the data talk for itself. And that's really been the goal for the company, is to elevate the brand by letting the data that we process really be front and center, and less so about, the executive team, and less so about us running around the industry talking about products and so on and so forth. Yes, that's a passion of ours. Obviously, we have to have a good product in order for it to work. But the data is the validator, right? And that this is what's happening. These are the true behaviors of these users and how they consume content, where they work, the industries, and so on. And so, yeah, our mission was to, first try to build a level of credibility that the brand didn't have when we first started the report. And by doing that, the dialogue has been elevated for us as a company, with not only with prospects but with people we don't know. And that's phenomenal to hear. Customers come in 2 years later and say, yeah, my first introduction to you was this report back in 2018. And I started checking it out, and I knew I needed to learn this stuff. Wasn't comfortable. No one in management believed in me, and I had no content marketing strategy at all. So they went off and did their work. And then they've kind of come back and said, well, all right, now I've got a strategy. It's time to execute. And I've got great content. And now I need you to activate it. And so that's really kind of where we've fell into play here.
Cool. So you've got this enormous report. I have gone through the entire thing. It is thick with data. There's a lot in there.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, being part of the team that helps to conceptualize this report should even exist and has seen all of the data in it, I'm sure, and all of that, what are 2 or 3 of the high level things that you got out of this year's report that you think listeners would want to know about the world of B2B? Like, what are some of like the 2 to 3 big ones that if they walk away from this episode knowing a little bit more about B2B, it will be one of these 3 things?
Yeah. So first, and this one comically comes up every year, but this year it turned out that 87% of all content being consumed within organizations is consumed below the C-suite. It kind of makes sense, right? When you think about that, there's just less C-suite people inside a company. Yet, the reason why it's always interesting to me and important to highlight is that when you talk to marketers, especially those that are being tasked with an execution from their CMO or their CEO says, we need to break into these companies or these accounts or in this industry, and we need to influence their C-suites or their executives. And so what's comical is the person who's tasked that team to do so is also the person that ironically isn't consuming that content, and their peers in the management team aren't going out and digesting webinars and registering for white papers. They're just not doing it. And so it's really important as a boots on the ground marketer to understand and use this data as a way to combat some of those disciplines and or initiatives that are being pushed down to you inside an organization, showing that user behavior doesn't match your aspirations. And so it's really important to use data to inform your reality, right? I've seen it constantly where a client might come to us and say, we're targeting this industry and this job level and this job function. We need to do 5,000 leads in a month. Well, we can look back at our own data and say, well, doesn't seem to be that there's even 5,000 people in the universe that match your criteria. Let's go check LinkedIn as another source. So we'll go into Sales Navigator and just do a raw query of those filters of those audiences and saying, how many people are listed in LinkedIn that match that criteria? Well, turns out there's 800. So where did you get this number? Oh, our CEO just said we need to do this. And it's like, well, that's a great example of if you're using data to inform your strategies, you're starting in a position of strength because you know your market realities. So that's one. The other is the consumption gap. And this is a phrase that we've formed, I want to say back in 2018. And it's a completely proprietary data stat that we invented, I suppose, that was based upon a random observation. And we had never tracked this before, but we always had the data. And so when you create content that's gated, you obviously have two timestamps, really. Every marketer has this. No one else talks about this until we started kind of productizing this stat, which is there's the moment the user registered for the content, and then there's the moment that the user actually got around to engaging with it, whether that's reading it, watching, listening, and so on. It turns out that it typically takes around 27 hours for the average user to dive into that content that they've registered for. It, depending upon job levels and industries and job areas, it can be more, it can be less. But out of processing 4.3 million leads over the past year, that netted out to around 27, 28 hours. That is hugely important to understand both as a marketing team, but more importantly, if you're in the B2B discipline and you're escalating those leads over to your sales colleagues, that context of knowing that the user hasn't read your content, hasn't viewed your webinar just because they registered for it, fundamentally needs to change your behavior. You cannot, and you see this constantly, happens to me every day. If I'm registering for someone else's content out on the web, I'll get an email and a phone call within minutes saying, "Hey, thanks. Just want to check, I want to make sure you've had a chance to check out the report." And it's like that literally minutes ago, I registered for this. I know nothing about your content. I have not read it. I don't plan on getting into it yet. And so right off the bat, you're kind of starting off on not only the wrong foot, but it's a bit tone deaf, right? We're all busy. And so the likelihood, if you think of this as an end user, that someone's just going to sit down and read your 50-page report like ours instantly, it's foolish, right? That's not going to be the case. There's a million things that they've got to do. They probably won't even read the whole thing. And so that gets to the need to really kind of create content that's nicely briefed. If you're using many other preferences out here, atomizing the content around trying to break things down, make it bite-sized, packaged, and even distill some of that larger asset like our report and break that down into kind of micro reports and things like that for quicker consumption. But yeah, if you ignore that reality, you're starting off on the wrong foot and really leading from a poor impression, I would say, of your brand, because you're not paying attention to users' needs and or the realities of how users behave with content. It's not to say that you can't reach out immediately. It's just the context of that initial reaching out. You shouldn't say, "Hey, thanks for downloading my report. Love to get your thoughts on it." All of the normal things that you'd probably see from sales. It's another thing to say, "Hey, thanks for downloading this report. There's a ton of great stuff in it. If you paid attention to their first party data that they provided to you, maybe you learned that they're in a certain industry." So as a salesperson, the best thing you could do is say, "Hey, check out page 37. I think it's going to be a really good one for you." And call attention to snippets of the content, or if it's a timestamp inside a video that's of particular relevance to that person, create that context and say, "Yeah, I'll be in touch in a week or so once you've had a chance to get to it. If you need anything in the meantime, I'm here." It's all about being a concierge, right? Being as helpful as possible, leading with value, hopeful that that value will translate into trust.
Dig it. Those are some really good insights, and ones that I immediately began thinking about the email marketing automation that comes after the lead magnet. And if there's that 28 hour, and I immediately start doing the math in my head, thinking about the time aspect of your report about the different times of day and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, well, maybe they're downloading it at 1 and then the next day at 10 a.m. is when they're actually getting to. So anyway, but yeah, there's a lot there. So let me ask you this. So those are a couple high level things that, that people should walk away with. Let's kind of flip that and say, what's something that people think is important, but that in going through the report, you learned that actually doesn't matter, right? I think that there's a lot of, for years I would get what's the best time to tweet? And I was like, it's kind of you can look at all these aggregated reports, you can get but ultimately it's going to be different for you and everybody else. But here's the general kind of gist of things, but don't worry about it too much. What are some of those things that you find yourself over and over having people say oh, they asked this particular question. You're like, well, we've looked at 40 petabytes of data and that's actually kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, it's a good question. I've often seen a lot of folks struggle with creating content associated to their own funnel. And so if you're a follower of the B2B industry as a whole and any B2B marketing practice, whether serious decisions and kind of their demand funnel, um, even before that, there's always been this association of associating content to the buyer's journey. I completely believe in the necessity for content being mapped to discrete problems and or pain points that users might have in their buyer's journey. I do not believe that buyers follow a linear path in their buyer's journey. So if you came to us and said, and or outside of Netline, and we're running a piece of content that was bottom of funnel content, typically bottom of funnel content would be content focused on perhaps vendor comparisons, pricing matrix and feature matrix types of content. Could even be maybe like a Forrester report, things like that, where there's a deep analysis going back and vendor by vendor comparisons, and even a Magic Quadrant type thing. The challenge with that is that you're entering it with this mindset that users follow this linear path of saying, well, today I'm going to go my exploration process of identifying vendors, and tomorrow I'm going to go beyond discovery and start going into deeper learnings and start comparing features and so on. More often than not, and everything that we see supports that, is that it's completely random. And it partly is random because of urgency. And so when you've got, let's say, a directive inside your company from the CEO saying we need to address this pain point immediately, you're bypassing a traditional funnel. You're simply going and saying, okay, I'm going to find some resource that consolidates the 100+ vendors that sell product X, find the top 5. I'm probably going to float an RFP to all 5 of them. And whoever comes back with the best price and the solutions that most appropriately fit my needs, they're going to get on a shorter list, and then we'll make a call. I've countless times done this myself, where I already know the vendors who are addressing a pain point that we might have. So I'm just going to skip their content entirely and go straight to pricing. And the pricing is a necessity because if I can decide whether a vendor is perhaps too rich, too expensive for our taste, I'm going to rule them out, regardless of their product being perhaps the better solution. That might be an enterprise grade solution, and we're a company of 50+ employees, and so the math just won't work for us, and that's is what it is. And so why go through that linear path of saying, okay, I've learned every possible nuance of this product and their solution and what this brand stands by, and I've went through 5 of their webinar case studies and so on, when in reality it's going to be a $300,000 investment and I've got a budget for a $30K investment. So more often than not, you see that happening where users are fast tracking their consumption and then going up and saying, okay, well, if I already figured out that you're probably a good one for me and I've got like 2 or 3 good ones, now I'm going to go up the funnel in terms of discovery and learn a little bit more about your products and your features and maybe a competitor that also uses you. And that's a great example of this mindset of saying, oh, I'm going to walk this user through this perfect funnel. And we're going to tick boxes actually in our marketing automation system saying that, nope, now they've scored and they've escalated. They've actually gone through this stage and they've requested this content. So therefore, they must be in bottom of funnel and ready to purchase. And that's just simply not the case. Unfortunate there's massive consultancies that run around preaching and teaching this. And it's a tough one because I think a lot of marketers have been conditioned to think this way, but content consumption behavior would say otherwise.
It's interesting because I whenever I'm dealing with a client, we always go through the funnel and the buying journey. And the reason we do it is because prior to that, there was just nothing. It's just like, it's blank. It's like an empty whiteboard, right? So like, if we're going to start somewhere, let's assume that we have people at different stages and you need content for each stage of the journey. I think what you're alluding to is that you probably need all of those pieces of the funnel. You just need to assume that people are going to enter it at different stages in a nonlinear fashion, and that they may bounce around from top of the funnel and middle of it. So and I often describe, so I have a diagram that I put together where what I show as the funnel is actually more like a web. I think what it really looks like is that you have people that are going to enter at different places, and they may wind up finding themselves back at the beginning of your funnel,
Exactly.
but in more of like a web type format, like they came in from the side, and it's not this linear thing. So I
That's
completely
exactly
buy
that.
that. I completely
Yeah.
buy that.
Yeah. And it's just about also thinking through your content to help create mentioning the web is perfect actually, because if you design your content well, you can have assets for every step of that journey, but most importantly have those assets interconnected, right? So whether it's a webinar and you are hosting it in some webinar interface, deep link inside that interface is like in a little resource area to other content that might be top of funnel content, beginning stages of the journey. Conversely, if you created like an ebook, which is typically an associated to top of funnel, more awareness and mass volume play, right? Creating as much inbound volume as possible. Have that ebook have a few embedded resources in there that deep link into bottom of funnel content too. Thereby, you're creating that web that you just described and not waiting on users to kind of traverse different elements of the web. You're kind of giving them the silk, if you will, within the web to kind of connect themselves to those various elements.
Yeah,
Yeah,
100%.
definitely makes sense.
Yeah. So, last thing I want to talk to you about with regard to the report is, and how long have you been doing the report? You personally, like how long have you been involved with it?
Since 2018.
2018. Okay, so you've been down this road before a number of times. So let me ask you this: this year, 2021, I think we can all safely assume that we have lived through some unprecedented experiences over the last year and a half. And this is, looking at, what's gone on since the beginning of COVID. And, I know you released a report the year before that touched on that a little bit. What surprised you when you looked at all of this stuff? There was so much data in there. I looked through and I found a couple things that I found surprising, but I'm curious, given, your depth in this, what are some data points that emerged, some things that you looked at and you're like, well, that's interesting. I didn't expect that. What are some of those things for you?
I think, and this might sound a little wishy-washy, but yeah, to me, what's intriguing is that, yeah, there was a 22% increase in content consumption. And I could just stop there and say, okay, well, yeah, COVID created a ton of uncertainty. But to me, from an aspirational perspective and perhaps emotional perspective, it it was an incredibly challenging period and arguably still is. Uh, it was really encouraging actually to see the types of things that were occurring across the platform by users leaning into content to solve human problems, right? This got past just business viability. This got back to safety and security, living another day from that perspective too. And it, it's yeah, it's a bit inspirational to see users in a moment of fear, right? I suppose we're always wired as humans to fight or flight, and through content consumption, it's proven that we as a populace chose to fight. And that's really encouraging because I, I suppose there were folks that just hunkered down and said, I'm not going to try to think of anything new or take on anything new. And let's just be afraid and hope that we get through the other side here. The content consumption data that we report upon says the otherwise, which that most professionals actually leaned into content to learn and distill knowledge that they could apply through this incredibly tough time. Yeah, there's a ton of other nuggets that are interesting in terms of formats exploding, like webinars. They went off the charts, massive growth, especially on-demand webinars. I don't know how long that'll live, right? I feel like there will be an adjustment back. We're always hearing about Zoom fatigue right now and so on, and webinar fatigue too. I do think that there will be a slight correction there, but this idea of users really only exclusively going back to more written content, I don't think that's the case. I think people naturally gravitate to faces, right? And trying to interact with humans. And since we're starting to be able to do that again outside of web content, that's exciting too. So I think another takeaway would be how hybrid content is created in the future. And I don't think anyone's doing this well, of having companion content that's easily consumed online and in a face-to-face environment with interactivity across both. That'll be an intriguing space to follow. Maybe we'll have stuff to talk about there in the future. But yeah, I suppose, my big takeaway is more of a philosophical one, and it's one that we've just not ever had to comment on, right? Like we just cover B2B data. We're not solving the world's problems. We're not curing cancer. We're not putting rovers on Mars. These are users who are translating the leads that ultimately develop pipeline for our customers. And for the first time in our history, things have become more serious than developing sales for clients, right? This was about life and death at some capacity, and it was interesting to cover. I hope we don't have to do it again. But yeah, it's encouraging to see people lean in and say, hey, I'm going to lean into some content to find my solutions and find a level of comfort that I don't have in this uncomfortable situation.
Wow. So the one I had written down is mobile consumption fell by about 7%, and you just went there. I was like, that's odd. And you were like, humans are fighters. Like, I appreciate the depth of the analysis there. I was not expecting that.
The mobile one, though, to tick that real quick, mobile just made sense to me, just because we're all stuck at home. And so there.
Okay, I hadn't considered that. I just think in general, like mobile's just going to keep going up.
I think you'll see a big correction.
Okay,
but to us, mobile's really always been about, especially because our type of content, right? You're not reading like an article or a blog post. Yeah. It tends to be pretty gated, heavy content, and so mobile tends to be stuff that we see at commute times, right? People are on the train or on a bus, or, and so they are engaging and or registering for content then they're at the office consuming it whenever time allows.
That makes more sense. I hadn't considered that. Well, let me ask you about a related fact, and this is the last question I'll have for you today. But the other one that I saw in the report that I thought was interesting is that the average time it took for professionals to consume content rose by over an hour from 28.5 to 29.7. So this is that, what you call the consumption gap. So like the time it took them between when they registered, when they checked it out, rose. That seemed curious to me, given that more of us are working from home. So it's like at the time that you're doing that, you're probably still at home. There's no commute. I didn't understand like what those possible factors could be. So I found that a little bit surprising. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. And sometimes when I was saying we let the data do the talking, it's true. And sometimes there are things that we report upon that are a bit mystifying, right? But the data is what it is. And so I suppose the hypothesis there is that being that we're at home, sure, we could easily consume that content. But being that we're home, we're also more easily distracted. We can do what we want, when we want, how we want, without any people and or peers looking over our shoulders to what we're looking into. That'd be my hypothesis. There's no proof to it. We don't survey users for this. This is not one of those reports where we're saying we're surveying 200 people and this is the visualized findings, right? This is 4.3 million leads and the raw data just being distilled. So yeah, it's intriguing. And we'll see how that changes. My guess is that as we're heading back into offices in some capacity, that'll change again. But yeah, your guess is as good as mine, quite honestly. It's an intriguing one.
Awesome. Well, the report is like mind-boggling. I've been following it for a couple of years now. And I just think it's such a wealth of information that B2B marketers, I think, are obviously the target people that should be reading it. But I think even if you're just a marketer in general, it's helpful to kind of understand what's going on out there and why. And if you're a B2C marketer, you may learn some things there. So thank you for coming on and geeking out with me and like letting me ask you a bunch of questions about this stuff. I appreciate how you look at things and how you explain things. I also appreciate that you guys are doing the whole first party data thing. It's a thing that I think quite a bit about, and I'm very much about data rights and things like that. So I appreciate you doing the good work. I want you to take this time in the show to promote the hell out of yourself and or Netline, and just think of this as your shameless plug time. You can talk about whatever it is you want, promote anything you want, completely your time in the show right now.
Yeah. So I'll do about Netline. I don't need to promote myself. Hop over to netline.com, grab yourself a copy of the report. It's available right on the homepage, or if you go into the resources sections there too. I'd also mention, take a look on the site, netline.com, for Audience Explorer. it's a free and interactive tool that's kind of a visualized front end on top of this report. So think of the report as a static snapshot that's a review of an annualized data set. Audience Explorer is a completely interactive tool. It's ungated, by the way, so you don't have to register for anything. And you can actually go in and say, I want to understand how, I don't know, accountants are consuming content. That'll then distill all of this data into a live report that you can then slice and dice by company size and industry and geographic location and see the types of content that perhaps accountants are gravitating towards, the most active in-market companies in a specific industry, and so on. So it's a fun tool. You get introduced to Luna, who's our mascot, and the Netline Explorer. It's a little astronaut. And yeah, we hope you have a good time. If you're digging into the report, though, and Audience Explorer, please share your feedback, and you can hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn.
Cool. And I will put that stuff in the show notes. Just again, another plug from me. I really, really love what you guys do at Netline. I think the product is amazing. For B2B marketers, it's absolutely something that you should, like, don't take my word for it. Just do your own little trial. Like, you don't have to spend a ton of money on this. Like, take $1,000 or $500 and go test out Netline. I'm extremely confident that you'll be like, I cannot believe I didn't know that this thing existed. Because that's
kind.
No, it's legitimately how I felt. I was like, oh God, I've been wasting so much time and money on other things when I could have just been doing this and looking like a rock star for my clients. So I'm a big fan. So I would.
Yeah, we're super appreciative. And hearing your story, it's super motivating. We use a lot of reviews on G2 to offer inspiration to those of us inside the company that really aren't on the front lines and don't get to hear this kind of great stuff.
Yeah.
So every time there's these types of experiences, it's extremely rewarding and affirming that we're on the right path, doing good work, and we'll continue to do so.
I'll tell you, I would be willing to bet almost every agency that utilizes Netline is probably a wealth of positive feedback, because agency environments are like dumpster fires. They're just like this insane, fast-paced. It's true. And I say it lovingly. Like, I've been doing the agency thing for like a decade now, but like, it is like madness. And, clients and deadlines and all these things. And like, you find this tool where you're like, in 48 hours, I can come back and look like an absolute like monster rock star to my client. It's really, really cool. So yeah, I would definitely say get a bunch of agencies on your short list, or if you have people internally who are having a rough day, be like, yeah, let me ring up this agency.
Yeah, most definitely.
3 minutes to say something nice. Well, anyway, I'm so glad you came on. I think that there's so much in this that people should really, they should definitely go check out the report. I hope that they learned something. And if they learned something, they should tell someone about it. And if they tell someone about it, I guess that would mean this episode is shareable. Wait, don't leave. If you've never listened to my fancy outro, do it just once for me, please. Okay, if you enjoy Shareable and you find it valuable, there's a few ways that you can support the show. 1, you can share it on social media, which I strongly encourage. I mean, it's literally the name of the show, Shareable. 2, you can review it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're an Overcast user, as many of my listeners are, make sure to click that star button on the episodes that you like. The third way that you could support the show is by blogging about it or discussing it on your own podcast, or even by making a YouTube video where you talk about one of the episodes. And then the final way that you can support the show is by supporting it directly on Patreon. You can find the link in the show notes. Now, before I let you go, I want to tell you about one other thing. You see, Shareable is just one of many projects that I'm working on at any given time. I've got another podcast called Rogue. I do a live streaming show every week called The Heroic Council. I've got a blog where I release a blog post twice a week. And if you're looking to keep up with all sorts of different content that can help you grow and become a superhero in life, I want you to check out jeffgibbard.me. That's where I list all of my current projects and projects that are coming up in the future, including my forthcoming book, The Lovable Leader. It would mean a lot to me if you could go and check out some of the other things I've worked on, because I put just as much of my heart into those projects as I do into Shareable. Thank you so much for being a listener. Thank you for being a supporter, and I hope to see you here on the next episode of Shareable.